Welcome to the Grounded in Peace podcast, where we explore what it means to cultivate peace within ourselves while working toward a more just and harmonious world. Join us as we uncover stories, practices, and ideas that inspire grounded collaborative action for lasting change.
All right, so I'm here today joined by Dr. William Vaughan of the Philosophy Department here at Ashland University, and we're here to talk about Kant's essay, Perpetual Peace. Welcome.
Hi, Craig. Good to be with you.
Great to be with you. And this is a little bit of a different focus or format than we've done on some of our podcasts, because we're going to be very focused on a particular text. And but with an awareness that listeners may not have just been reading Kant's Perpetual Peace. So could you start us off?
Absolutely. It's a particular text by a thinker who's been so influential. He's like a watershed thinker. But the problem is also he's a German philosopher, and it's so difficult to read a lot of Kant's regular texts. So this might be one of his most accessible works. So if a listener out there has been looking for a entry ramp to reading somebody like Kant, this would be a good book to start. He wrote it for a general audience. It doesn't have the same sort of nomenclature or just architectonic vocabulary of his other works, which can be really intimidating and difficult. So this is like a gateway text.
Yeah, and I was, so I definitely noticed that as I read. And it made me wonder if, so maybe intentionally he didn't, go into the philosophical minutia that he does in his other works. Would you say that, or is it philosophically lacking in depth?
No. I would describe it like this, that by the time Kant wrote this text, he was so famous that a lot of readers come to it knowing that a lot of the best arguments are just off stage.
Oh, right.
So he was not good at public writing. It's kind of awkward, and he's got some awkward moments in this text. But you have to couple this text, and Kant wrote this late in life. So a lot of his stuff later in life were just sort of smaller articles, not these gigantic tomes of systematic philosophy.
Yeah.
They're just a little bit more piecemeal. He never got around to writing a complete systematic political philosophy or critique of political reason or something like that.
Right. So
that's kind of interesting, right? You have to sort of pick things up and piece them together on his behalf.
So it's nice that it's accessible. I mean, I think, anyone would appreciate that. And I mean, what should we know about its historical context or maybe the philosophical? I mean, I imagine, so he wrote this at the end of the 18th century from Prussia. And so can you help us locate it in history, and maybe locate it, if it's, how necessary is it to locate it in his broader philosophical projects?
I'm more philosophy professor than history professor.
Okay.
But the text really emerges as a convergence of historical issues and intellectual or philosophical issues. Kant actually came late in life to a lot of his most important work. So it wasn't until his late 50s and all the way through his 60s that he started to get world acclaim. Mm-hmm. But within the space of a decade, his work was being taught in every university in Europe. And Kant was sort of in the middle of nowhere. I mean, he's from this town, Königsberg.
Mm-hmm.
It's still almost in the middle of nowhere. It's now part of today Russia. In fact, it changed its name to Kaliningrad.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some talk about changing it back to Königsberg. But he was in the middle of nowhere, so he sort of comes out of nowhere and then suddenly is put on the world stage by historical events. The most important historical event was the French Revolution. So here you've got this world-class intellectual, and basically the whole continent turns to him with interest and curiosity as to what he is going to say about these monumental political events. And what happens is he writes for the general audience, and he generates this book that has not gone out of print in 200 years. It's served as a sort of normative standard for international relations ever since. So he's giving a powerful statement, symbolic statement in this book, in this text, symbolic statement of the possibilities for peace, consistent with reason. And wow, it's been enormously influential along those lines.
So the League of Nations, the United Nations, I mean, when we think about, so one of the main points is we need to have a federation of nations. The law of nations shall be founded on a federation of free states. I mean, it's not where he starts, but I mean, that seems to be one of the main things that I've always heard associated with this text. So that's an enormous, I mean, I can't imagine it's the only factor in the creation of the UN, but I mean, on the other hand, this is that is the kind of thing he has in mind. Is that right?
But we would today call it kind of a loose federation. So he did not want a top-down structure of sorts. And later Kantians, 20th century Kantians, of course, have developed it in a variety of different directions. So if you think about it in terms of a loose confederation of states, that's probably more in line with what Kant intended.
Okay.
But you're exactly right. I mean, it was central in the historical development of the League of Nations and the United Nations. Woodrow Wilson cites it, cites this text. And, you know, you've got major figures like Kofi Annan praising Kant, and even Gorbachev quoted it in his Nobel Prize winning speech, or Nobel Peace Prize speech.
Yeah.
So the text just has tremendous legs. It continues to influence people hundreds of years later.
One of the
one more thing about I mean, he writes it in the form of a kind of a treaty. So it's
interesting.
Like a pretend treaty.
Yeah, right. Of course, he talks about treaties explicitly, but you're saying in the form of a treaty.
Right. If everyone could just get together and sign this treaty and think this treaty, and there's been a lot of discussion on exactly what he means by, definitive articles and preliminary articles, those sorts of things. If you're reading this for the first time, I wouldn't get bogged down in any of those details.
Okay.
It's written in the form of a treaty to try to entice folks as to the seriousness of the issues, namely, is it possible to have rational justification for ethical principles in the political sphere on that international scale?
Right.
I mean, that's a huge issue even today.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's got this, the state of nature is war. He isn't naive about realities of war. On the other hand, he has a lot to say about nature, kind of bringing, I'm trying to find here, kind of bringing us along such that with the right kinds of structures in place, political structures, we won't have to depend on people being good, it seems to me. I mean, he has some stuff about that. And, I'm interested in ethics and this kind of thing. And actually, in this podcast, we often are talking about, it seems to me like the opposite, but like way to peace, but a way to peace that's much more kind of personal and virtue oriented, or, rooted in someone's morality. But he doesn't want to depend on that. Does that sound right?
That's right. Kant makes reference to war in this text, but make no mistake, he's doing so because he doesn't want to come across as naive. He's got some other articles which indicate, the differences between theory and practice. He doesn't want to be accused of pie-in-the-sky utopianism. So he acknowledges levels of war and violence between human beings. But the major takeaway of this essay is that peace is rational. But at the end of the day, nations can engage in if you abide by certain rules.
Right.
Nations can engage and come to rational solutions regarding their problems. He casts it sometimes in terms of intellectual maturity,
right,
or progress. And moral progress is possible in the political sphere. So right there, you've got a lot to talk about, right? In the political sphere, you've got folks like political realists, like Kissinger and folks like that, who argue that ethics really doesn't have any role to play in politics. It's very muscular. It's sort of power politics, and there's no room for ethics. There's hardly any room for ethics or reason at all, just maybe instrumental applications of reason, but not pure reason, not transcendental reason.
Okay.
That's what Kant is going for. There are profound, rationally based structures to expand a reasonable and, for him, Republican sphere in the political domain that can make fundamental moral progress between human beings.
Yeah. Let's talk about what some of those are. I mean, it seems like some of the core ideas have got to be rights and duties. That plays a big role. And then he has this kind of form of government, which is structures that are constitutional, that are in constitutional republics.
Right. So he's not inventing anything out of whole cloth along those fronts. I mean, if more and more states would adopt Republican forms of representation, if more and more states agreed to a federation of free states abiding by certain rules, and if more and more states based a kind of interrelationship between themselves, limiting it to hospitality, right? Very, very important idea. Those three features will serve as a starting point for foundations of morality in politics. But all of the other things, the things that we Americans are familiar with, freedoms, freedom of press, freedom of religion, all those freedoms are completely included in Kant's views.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's not inventing structures out of whole cloth, but he's arguing how, philosophical foundations of Republican forms of government can be given profoundly serious and deep intellectual foundation. And that's what Kant does in other texts.
Okay. Well, so because he uses language that makes it sound like these different, and again, I can't imagine this is original to him, but we would say like separation of powers that are pursuing their own selfish ends, but then they kind of interlock with each other in this kind of rigid way so that they can't actually budge too much relative to the others. So like if we have three branches of government, he actually identifies the same three branches that we have in the United States Constitution with the same rationale, as I understand it. The idea is that a rational approach to this is that we can't rely on people being of goodwill who inhabit those spheres, but they're kind of bound by the way that they're set up oppositionally to the other spheres. Exactly. Is that the rational? I mean, should we think of that as a rational? The outcome of rationality has given us that?
Exactly right. That rationality in its pure form gives us rigid structures that, if followed, if consistently adopted, will yield rational outcomes. So, and it will also yield greater levels of individual freedom for people rationally pursuing those outcomes. So this gets formalized by later thinkers. Kant just sort of throws it out there. And you've got a bunch of 20th century philosophers like Rawls who want to make more rigorous precisely what these rules are. And all of that comes from this essay, Toward Perpetual Peace. So imagine two rational agents sitting down. And you and I want to make some progress on some of disputes or discussions. What are the ground rules for our discussion? Well, Kant will argue, or the Kantian will argue, that if we reflect back on our rational natures, reason itself requires certain background conditions and structures in order to obtain. There has to be, each of us have to be allowed to express our viewpoints fully. Each of us have to be allowed to introduce whatever issues we want or raise any questions. Each of us have to be allowed to question each other's assertions. We have to be allowed to freely defend ourselves.
Yeah.
And we have to do so with public reasoning. Everybody has to be able to see the work, so to speak.
Right.
Like back in old math class, you couldn't just come up with the answers. You had to show your work. And Kant was very open to that as well. So any external mechanisms which distort those structures are going to compromise our capacities for rational outcomes for peace. So by reflecting on the conditions for rational agents to have an exchange, to have a discourse, we can think about the conditions in general that will yield greater levels of reasonableness, and for Kant, greater levels of peace.
So let's spend some more time on that, because one thing, he's not advocating a one-world government, and he talks about how nature's given us differences of religion and language to ensure that that's just never going to happen. So he doesn't have that, but on the other hand, a federation of nations isn't going to be governed by, there's no legislative body that's going to, establish laws that kind of reach across them. So what's the nature of how should we understand the nature of the agreements, the ground rules? Because they can't be legislated in the same way as they are within nations.
Right. That's exactly one of the virtues that we see in this essay, that Kant and later Kantians don't want a top-down approach, but they want to articulate the conditions that will allow agents or countries to negotiate those conditions themselves. Right? So rational agents involved in a dispute ought to be allowed, and Kant believed that they would be able to negotiate the very conditions by which they negotiate.
Yeah.
Right? The rules for negotiation itself. And he's going to argue that all political structures, all legal structures, if following these formats, will have a kind of rational legitimacy that will be self-evident.
Okay. And there are economic dimensions to this, too, that, one of the cautions, well, I don't know what we call them, the first 6 things that he talks about, right. They're prohibited, like don't break treaties or don't write a treaty such that there's like a get out clause built in. There are things like that. But one of them is to not, I don't know if I can find it, national debts, this is number 4 of 6. National debts shall not be contracted with a view to the external friction of states. I'm not sure I understood that. But don't go into debt.
Well, he talks a lot about debt. He also talks a lot about conditions of peace and not always preparing for war.
Right.
So it'd be interesting.
Well, no standing armies, for example. And George Washington warned against that.
Well, and it's a challenge to try to translate those ideas into like Cold War conditions. What would Kant, on the basis of this essay, have said about the Cold War? Now, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
But in general, he seems to want to allow as much freedom as possible for people to pursue their interests, pursue those interests as long as they are, consistent within moral norms. Again, I don't want to bring in any hardcore philosophical distinctions, but he makes a difference between autonomy and heteronomy in ethics. Autonomy is when rational agents understand the rules by which they make decisions. And if you and I are both rational agents, eventually we could come to some agreement as to what those rules are.
Yeah.
An example I sometimes give in class is many years ago, I was a grad student, and I would set up conferences for mathematicians at the University of Illinois. And I learned that all these mathematicians, none of them spoke English. They spoke multiple different languages. And I remember going to the professors and saying, hey, this conference is going to be a disaster. No one speaks the same language.
They speak math.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
And what happens at these math conferences is that eventually everyone comes to speak, maybe not the same, because they're different mathematical languages, but similar enough languages that they can come to understand themselves and each other.
Okay.
That's the Kantian model.
Although I pictured that Kant might be perfectly happy with there being a lot of tension between nations, but they can't actually, they're kind of prevented from going to war because they have all these kind of conflicting and interlocking interests that their own interests would be imperiled so much by war. They just kind of refuse. That's why maybe the Cold War could be, there's a lot of tension, right? But it's not a hot war, which is obviously worse. So that might, Kant be okay with that. It's probably not as good as a friendlier alternative, but.
Well, it's like what they used to say in the Vietnam War, right? As long as they're talking.
Okay, yeah.
As long as the parties are interacting, there's the hope for rational outcomes that are peaceful. But he does give a lot of voice to war and violence. He doesn't advocate it, but I think he is realistic enough to see that war and violence is an expression of the sort of barbaric nature of unleashed, what he would call heteronymous humanity.
Yeah.
These are folks who, these conditions are not governed by reason. These conditions are not run through his powerful categorical imperatives. Well, that's another thing that's in the background of this text.
Yeah. Well,
the all-powerful
he cites himself at some point.
He mentions them.
Yeah.
So he assumes that his readers are familiar with them. And as I said earlier, a lot of the power of this text is right off stage. And that's one of those power engines are these categorical imperatives, very famous principles by Kant, where he tried to argue, and there's the universalization requirement. That's the first categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you could will that your maxim be a universal law. And then the second categorical imperative, very famous, you should treat others always as ends in themselves and never merely as a means. You can't objectify others.
And that was one of his arguments against standing armies, because you have these standing armies are actually treated as, these hired hands. And they're made to kill and die, and they're being treated as objects.
Sort of built-in objectifications.
Yeah.
So imagine what he's trying to do. He's trying to bring in the power and purity of this way of thinking, categorical imperatives, into the political sphere. And that's a tall order. Yeah. So, and there's been a tremendous amount of debate and discussion as to whether or not he's really successful in pulling that off.
Well, he's considered an idealist, right? And I guess I don't fully know what that means in philosophical language, but here he's trying to say, look, I'm not an idealist in the kind of everyday sense of that word.
I think our political philosophers would describe it, not to oversimplify it, but you've got the folks in the liberal tradition, right? Liberalism, arguing that it's possible to apply rational categories to these things and make moral progress. And then you've got the realists, political realism, which argues that it's a Hobbesian situation, that we are in a will to power context, and moral philosophy really doesn't belong in the political sphere.
Right.
Both of those camps have been widely discussed and expressed in the 20th century. A lot of blood has been spilled in the 20th and 21st century. But Kant is on the liberal side of things. He fervently believes, and this document is a powerful symbolic expression of possibility of the application of reason and ethics in politics. Yeah.
As an observer of our world, what kind of Kantian advice do you think might be given to efforts at the kind of Federation of States, Federation of Nations, or other efforts that maybe sort of, we have thanks to Kant, but maybe I have no idea how happy he'd be with our efforts, or even our constitutional republic
Well, when conditions get worse, when conditions worsen, there's still the possibility for rational discourse. As long as we don't think of it as a top-down straitjacket on the parties.
Mm-hmm.
But those conditions are negotiated by the parties themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Kantian ideal. And so I think sometimes Kant is criticized for shoving like universal human rights down people's throats or something like that, or challenging conditions of national sovereignty. But gosh, in today's world, you don't have to look very far to see growing clouds of conflict. We've got natural resource scarcity across multiple countries. We've got climate-induced political instability across countries. How do we possibly resolve these disputes? Is it still possible to rationally resolve these disputes?
Mm-hmm.
I think the Kantian gesture is to step back and look at the rules by which we can even conduct these discussions. And if all of the parties feel that they are being heard, all of the parties understand those rules, they're not going to be ignored or oppressed, or not allowed to question, not allowed to pursue the truth to the fullest extent, and those negotiations are going to break down. But if those conditions can be preserved, possibility for rational peace exists.
Do you think Kant envisioned that the Federation of Nations would be comprised of nations that are relatively similar in terms of their size and strength and economic health and power and things like that? Because I'm thinking about if there's a real difference. I mean, we absolutely see that breakdown in real time, but does Kant anticipate situations where there's a radical difference between nations?
He honestly believed that those types of inequalities and divisions could be reconciled through public use of reason, even if by proxy. Right? I mean, this is a fundamental Kantian question. Can we really fairly represent all parties?
Mm-hmm.
I teach an animal ethics class, and there's one chapter with, is it possible to push Kantian principles even in the domain of how we treat animals?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the answer is yes. Those animals might not be capable of reasoning, but their interests can be represented by proxy.
Yeah.
So too can children. So too can other countries. So in principle, he's interested in the ground rules by which conflict can be resolved.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good. So,
and that includes what we've today called cosmopolitan structures, cosmopolitan public structures across international divisions.
What would be an example of that?
Well, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Article 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to food.
Yeah.
So do human beings have a right to food? If people come on a boat to the United States, don't they have minimal rational conditions?
Yeah, and he writes about that. Well, I don't know about food, but hospitality for people who arrive at your shores.
Right. He casts it in sort of a minimum condition. He's not granting out of the gates.
It's not maximal hospitality.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, again, Kantians make a difference between our having perfect duties and imperfect duties. We have a perfect duty to tell the truth, but there's some circumstances in which we have an imperfect duty. But what that phrase means is, if you have a perfect duty to do something, you have to do it all the time, regardless of the consequences.
Okay.
But if you have an imperfect duty, that means there are some conditions. There are some qualifying conditions. There are some exceptions.
Yeah.
And I think Kant would say that we have an imperfect duty to treat people coming to our shores, immigrants, migrants, with hospitality. That reason dictates that. Reason requires that minimal condition. We have to respect the humanity in other human beings enough to provide them And I think the Kantian would say provide them food, minimum levels of shelter and medical care. That's...
appeals to reason, as I know of this sort have been critiqued.
Controversial. Yes.
And I mean,
very much so.
One of those, a feature of that critique is that, you have Kant saying, like assuring us that such and such is reasonable. But I mean, not everyone's use of reason kind of shows up in exactly the same way as his. And he had a famously, impressive brain. But on the other hand, there's got to be a risk in saying, well, he was just more reasonable than the rest of us, because you look around and we're not all reasoning the same way. So can you bring us up to date in terms of, I mean, we may just have to end with this, but I know this is kind of maybe a big question, but bring us up to date in terms of where do the critics of this kind of reason, where does that kind of critique leave this document and the kind of hopefulness that you seem to have in that project?
Well, you asked your question in 30 seconds. And it could probably take 30 minutes
take
to
at
respond.
least. Oh, okay.
But you're definitely right. I mean, one person's a priori categories of rationality could be another person's straitjacket. Mm-hmm. And so there's been real pushback against the Kantian project that his universalization principles might go a little bit too far. Mm-hmm. Or some people have argued have gone way too far, or that Kant himself was oblivious to forms of violence, right on his shores. I mean, he doesn't say word one about, he doesn't seem to register anything about what we would today call internal, like colonial aspects of violence. He doesn't say enough about slavery. Mm-hmm. He doesn't say enough about a lot of these huge conditions. So a lot of scholars in the 20th century have come along and scolded Kant for that, like any great thinker. Yeah. They're going to have real blind spots, especially these Enlightenment figures. Mm-hmm. I mean, Kant didn't sleep with his slaves, or he didn't invest in the slave trade, mm-hmm. John Locke. Mm-hmm. But his silence is deafening sometimes on a lot of these things. And a lot of late Kantian scholars have tried to retrofit his views to more contemporary contexts, but it's controversial. Yeah.
Well, but you're here saying this is still worth reading and this is worth paying attention to. Is that what you'd like?
I'm here saying that, like a lot of these, like a lot of Western philosophers, they're like watershed figures. Yeah. You can love them or you can hate them, but you're going to have to go through them. Yeah. And Kant is one of those figures. He's just so important. His influence is so great, positive and negative. Yeah. That learning a little bit about Kant, learning a little bit about some of the contemporary thinkers who speak and write in Kant's name, I think will pay dividends. And this is a good article to start with.
Good. This is a great way to start introduction to Kant, to a lot of these ideas. Anyone who's peace-loving should probably put in the hard work here and at least deal with this text in some fashion. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time and guiding us and giving some thoughts. Do you have any parting thoughts or any final advice?
Don't operate heavy machinery after reading German philosophy.
Oh, okay. Take care of yourself. A little self-care.
Yeah. It's hard work, but I think it will repay your hard work at reading.
Good. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks for having me.